Well, here we are. No, we're not in Los Angeles or even Washington or New York. We're in good old sunshine Melbourne. But as you know, the backdrop usually is more important than what I'm talking about. You know, that's what people are more interested in, the backdrop. So Kelly and I do everything we can to bring you the best backdrops in Melbourne. Now, I think this week I've been waiting a while. I haven't done a YouTube for about 10 days on purpose. I've been waiting to see what pans out as far as the George Floyd fiasco goes, both in the United States of America, in Australia and overseas. And I've been interested in the fact that the people in the United States are called demonstrators. Now, what we are seeing in the United States, unlike most of the other parts of the world, is not demonstrations or a series of demonstrations, but what we are seeing is a classical uprising, mainly peaceful, but an uprising which has crossed racial divides, cultural and social barriers. I mean, the demonstrations come and go, but it's been 13 to 14 days since Mr. Floyd was murdered, and we can just continue to see increasing numbers of people across the United States coming together to show their disgust and dissatisfaction with what's happened in the United States. And obviously we've seen protests in other parts of the world and in Australia, where it didn't take Australians long to realise that the situation that has occurred in the United States of America is not just specific to America, but it's very specific to the situation of First Nations people in Australia. Now, since the Royal Commission into deaths in custody, and remember in 1991 when it was first held, there were only 99 deaths in custody. In 2020, we're looking at 432 deaths in custody. Obviously, not all of them are directly related to violence, but they raise important questions about the number of Indigenous Australians in prisons in this country. Although Indigenous adults make up 2% of the population, the population of Indigenous adult prisoners is about 30% across the country. 30%. Not because there are more violent people, but because of the nature of the situation they find themselves in. It was good to see so many Australians actually begin to wake up that the George Floyd issue is not just an issue in the United States of America, that it's an issue here that has occurred since colonisation began on the 26th of January 1788. And the colonisation process, as you know, continues. So, do we have an insurrection? No, we don't have an insurrection. There's a little bit of violence at the beginning of the protests. That calmed down quite quickly when people understood the overwhelming force that the United States government was willing to use on protesters in order to maintain, in their opinion, law and order. But what we have seen is a mass outpouring of anger and outrage at the systemic way things have occurred and the systemic way things are occurring in this country. Now, I would have liked to have seen this uprising and protests, uprising in the United States of America and protests in the rest of the world, to take on an extra dimension. Because racism does not exist independently of the type of community we find ourselves in. It doesn't exist independently of poverty. It doesn't exist independently of inequality in society. And let's not forget that in the United States of America, economically, the bottom 40% own 0.3% of the resources. That's right, 40%, 0.3. And when we remember that 8 people own about 1/3 of the planet's wealth, we begin to understand that growing inequality is at the very heart, in many respects, of racism. It's not just a matter of somebody's skin or cultural background or where they were born. It's much more than that. It's about exploitation. The essence of racism is exploitation. Exploitation of groups of people because other people want to make a profit from exploiting their labour. Let's not forget that the slave trade, which resulted in over 20 million Africans, mainly West Africans, being transported to the Caribbean and the United States in the 18th and 19th century, and the American Civil War, was directly related to the fact that one group of people was willing to exploit the labour of another group of people and treat them as little more than disposable commodities, animals to be slaughtered, to be worked to death. And that was the basis of slavery. It was about having free labour to grow tobacco, to grow cotton, to feed the industrial machine in England and Europe and the United States. And the Civil War in the United States of America again was about property rights. It was about landowners having access to free labour. And we had the same situation in Australia during the convict period, when convicts were used as free labour. And we continue to have the same situation in many prisons in the United States and Australia, where prisoners' labour is used for profit. So at the very heart and the basis of racism is inequality. It's that inequality where we think because somebody is a different colour or speaks a different language or is a different cultural background that we can exploit their labour. It's like the 1.7 million temporary workers in this country. Some do very well, but most are used as almost slave labour, paid cash in hand, do horrible work for minimal pay, and if they complain they get deported. So again, we have to look at the root causes of the inequality that exists, that creates that climate of racial inequality and creates that climate of people being, unequal. It's quite extraordinary. In the United States of America, we had the rednecks, and I don't think most people understand who the rednecks were. When we talk about a racist, we talk about a redneck. Rednecks were poor, agricultural, white workers whose neck was red because they worked with their hands in the sun alongside Negro workers. They were poorly paid, but the problem was that they never saw that their exploitation was directly linked to the exploitation of Afro-Americans. Like in Australia, with the race riots in the 1850s and 1860s against the Chinese, and the creation of the White Australia policy, which was in our Constitution. Section 51 in the Australian Constitution gives the government the power to make legislation specific to a person's racial origin. And that's why they were able to introduce the emergency in Aboriginal communities, the emergency intervention 13, 14 years ago. And that intervention, that legislation continues to stand there. So what we've got is racial inequality, which to a large degree is factored on the exploitation of people's labour. It's the exploitation of people's labour, not in terms of a specific group, but in terms of a specific subset of the population, maybe because of their colour, maybe because of their features. And the dilemma has been, for centuries, is the white ruling classes have used white working class people and people who are disaffected and marginalised as their bother boys and girls. They're the ones who've been at the very heart of that battering ram that ensures that racism continues in our society. Now, the great thing about what we are seeing in the United States of America and what we are seeing in Australia and other parts of the world is the breakdown of that racial divide. that people are beginning to understand that it doesn't matter whether the person who's got their foot on your neck or their knee on your neck is black or white. It's a matter of inequality. And if we can address the question of inequality, we can also address the question of racism. And that's why nothing ever seems to change. Whether it's the situation of First Nations people in Australia, where over 250 years we've seen exploitation, we've seen their lands removed, we've seen them murdered, dispossessed, marginalised, living on the outskirts of mainstream society, or whether it's the United States of America, where Afro-Americans continue to be, with Native Americans, continue to be at the bottom of the pecking order. So, in order to tackle racism, we need to tackle inequality. That's the key. Because if you don't tackle inequality, you don't resolve the issues that have allowed racism to flourish. Whether it's in Australia, where we do see many racist tendencies against every new migrant group that comes into this country, whether they're from Africa, whether they're Southern Europe 50 years ago, whether they're from Asia. But if we don't tackle the question of race inequality, we will never be able to tackle the question of racism, because we will be divided in such a situation that we never come together, and those that exercise power, that small percentage of people that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the investment classes continue to exploit and divide us. I mean, that old saying, united we stand, divided we fall, is very pertinent to the question of racism. It's not just a question for black Australians. It is not just a question for black people around the world. It is a question of us as individuals and as communities coming together and understanding the root of our oppression. The people who oppress us, irrespective of our colour of our skin, our cultural backgrounds, the languages we speak, our religious beliefs or non-beliefs, are the same people. And what you see in many so-called independent countries, where there is a black majority, we see that ruling class in those countries exploit people, as we saw in Sudan with the overthrow of the dictator al-Bashir, as we see across the world, where it doesn't matter what your colour of your skin is. What matters is the amount of power you have and the amount of wealth you have and how you exercise that power and wealth. And while we continue to be divided, we will continue to have racism. While we continue to have inequality, we will continue to have racism in our society. So we need to not only directly tackle the issue of racism, as we are seeing with the Uprising in the United States of America and the protests in Australia and the rest of the world, but what we need to look at is a much deeper question. And as the Uluru Statement from the Heart said in 2017, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, delegates from across this country's First Nations people and the islands around this country had three central demands. The first central demand is truth-telling. You cannot reconcile without truth-telling. The second demand was a voice to Parliament. How can you get people who have no understanding of the situation of First Nations people making legislation for First Nations people, as we saw with the emergency intervention? And the third was discussion towards a treaty or treaties with this country's First Nations people. So we don't want the death of over 400 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in custody since 1991. We don't want the huge number of Indigenous people in prisons in Australia today If you're an Indigenous man, you have 15 times more chance of being in prison, and if you're an Indigenous woman, 21 more times of being in prison than other members of this population. We don't want to see these protests peter out. What we want to see is these protests broaden into not just protests about police brutality and institutional racism, but protests about the type of society we are, the type of society we can become, protests against inequality, and for us to understand that if we stand shoulder to shoulder, irrespective of our religious beliefs or no beliefs, irrespective of our sexual orientation, irrespective of our gender, irrespective of our race or the colour of our skin, irrespective of whether we're young or old, that we need to stand together to finally stamp out practices which are totally unacceptable in any society, let alone a society which claims it is democratic and civilised.